Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to talk about something pretty amazing today. How a country totally battered by war and economic collapse somehow managed to create some of the most groundbreaking literature of the entire 20th century. So how on earth does a crisis like that end up forging a whole new kind of art?
All right, let's get right into it. I mean, just look at this contrast. It's a huge shift, right? At the start of the 1900s, Britain was, on top of the world, the undisputed global superpower, an empire where the sun literally never set. But fast forward just 50 years, and everything's changed. After two brutal wars and economic chaos, it's a nation that's, well, a shadow of its former self, trying to figure out its new place in the world. So the big question is, what on earth happened in those 50 years?
Well, the short answer is that Britain was hit by 3 decades of just unbelievable shocks. These crises didn't just shake the old world, they completely tore it apart, forcing everyone to face a pretty brutal new reality.
So the first shock, and it was a big one, was a war unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. You have to remember, this was Britain's first major European war in 100 years. They were totally, completely unprepared for the destructive power of modern weapons. We're talking machine guns, tanks, submarines. It was a whole new kind of warfare. And all the old rules, not just for war, but for life itself, they were just obliterated in the trenches.
750,000. That's how many British soldiers died. It's a number that's it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. We're talking about an entire lost generation.
And then you have this number, 2 million seriously wounded. So when you put those two figures together, you start to get a sense of the scale of this thing. The trauma of the war, it touched pretty much every single family, every street, every town in the country. It left scars you could see and a whole lot you couldn't. And here's the really crucial thing to get. This wasn't just one crisis they could bounce back from. Nope, it was a relentless, non-stop series of shocks. I mean, just as the country was even beginning to deal with the trauma of the Great War, bam, the Great Depression hits. And right after that, a Second World War, one that was even more devastating.
So, out of all this chaos, something had to give. And it did. The very foundations of British society, they started to shift in a huge way. The old certainties people had lived by for generations, they weren't just being questioned anymore. They were literally crumbling.
And what's so fascinating about this period is that it wasn't just one thing changing. It was everything, all at once. Every single pillar of the old world was being challenged. You had politics getting totally upended with the rise of the Labour Party, the Empire, that was starting its long, slow transformation into the Commonwealth. And right at home, the really rigid class system and the traditional role of women, all of it was being completely redefined.
And this is a huge one. By 1928, women finally got the same voting rights as men. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a political tweak. It was a massive social shift. Think about it. Women's absolutely crucial role in the factories during the war, doing the jobs of the men who were away fighting. It made the argument for their right to vote completely undeniable. It was a real game changer. So, okay, the old world is gone. It's in pieces. This brings up a massive question for artists and writers, right? How do you even begin to tell stories about this new, chaotic, fragmented reality? The old ways of writing, the old styles, they just weren't going to cut it. They had to invent a completely new language for a new age. Yeah, this new generation of writers, who we now call the modernists, they basically looked at the traditional novel and said, this doesn't work anymore. I mean, how could a simple, straightforward plot really capture a world of shell shock, of constant anxiety about money, of all your core beliefs just collapsing around you? It couldn't. They knew they had to find a new way to tell stories, a way to write from the inside out.
Okay, so let's look at some of these pioneers. First up, D.H. Lawrence. Now, his background is super important. He was the son of a coal miner, so he had a foot in 2 different worlds, the old, raw, working-class world and the new, modern, intellectual one. And his work just dives headfirst into those deep, sometimes really primal conflicts that happen inside our relationships.
And this slide really gets to the heart of what his books are all about. For Lawrence, there was this constant battle going on. On one side, you have our raw, natural instincts, that primal energy, the body. And on the other side, you have modern industrial society, the mind, the intellect, all the rules that he felt just crushed our true vitality. And that struggle, that's what creates all the explosive drama in his most famous novels. All right, our next pioneer is Virginia Woolf. And this quote, it just perfectly sums up what she was trying to do. See, she wasn't that interested in the big external events of a story, what people did. She wanted to get inside their heads. She wanted to capture that incredibly complex, always changing, internal world of what people thought and felt. For her, the real story was always the one happening inside the mind.
So, how did she do it? Well, her solution was a pretty radical new technique called stream of consciousness. The best way to think about it is like you're plugging directly into a character's brain and just reading their raw, unfiltered thoughts. The story jumps all over the place, from a memory to a random thing they see to a deep feeling, because, well, that's exactly how our own minds work every single second, right?
And she used this revolutionary style to create some absolute masterpieces. We're talking about books like Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse. And they're not like other novels. They don't really have a traditional plot. Instead, they just explore these huge themes like personal identity, memory, how time passes, in a way that nobody had ever tried before. It's a really beautiful, almost poetic kind of writing.
Okay, for our last pioneer, let's turn to poetry with W.H. Auden. Now, he was really the voice of a new generation. These were the young people who grew up staring at the economic wreckage of the Great Depression, and Auden's poetry gave a voice to all of their anxieties.
And here's the crucial difference with Auden. An earlier poet, like T.S. Eliot, famously wrote about the wasteland as this big metaphor for a spiritual crisis. But for Auden, the wasteland wasn't a metaphor at all. It was real. It was the literal landscape of poverty, of closed factories and mass unemployment that he saw all around him.
You could almost say he acted like a doctor for the country. His method? Well, he took the most cutting-edge ideas of his day, psychology from Freud, economics from Marx, and he used them to diagnose the sickness he saw in English society. And then he wrote the prescription in this totally new kind of poetic language that was somehow both incredibly smart and also really down to earth, using the language of everyday speech.
Okay, so, pulling it all together, what can we take away from this? What's the big lesson about this incredible link between a national crisis and this explosion of artistic creativity?
I think, ultimately, the reason this literature is still so powerful is because it wasn't just written about history. It was a direct, creative, and sometimes messy response to the chaos as it was happening. These writers were desperately trying to find new ways to make sense of a world that had stopped making any sense. You could say they were trying to build a new kind of meaning right there in the rubble of the old world.
And that really leaves us with one final thought. When our own world feels chaotic or uncertain, when it feels like the old rules are changing right under our feet, who are the artists telling our story today? Who are the people shaping the way we understand it all? Basically, who are the D.H. Lawrences, the Virginia Woolfs, and the W.H. Audens of our time?